welcome Devyani Sharma, who is going to talk to us about repertoire control and awareness, how individual cognition drives group change in London English. Devyani has joined, I think a year ago, maybe Oxford University. She was at the Queen Mary University of London for a very long time before that, and I think at King's before that as well. So Devyani has been part of the community for a long time. And I think it's fair to say that you're probably one of the most prominent, outstanding social linguists in the country and probably worldwide as well. So we're very pleased to have Devyani. Don't be shy. I think this is quite impressive. Devyani has worked a lot on varieties of English, I think, to start with. So she has a big project on London English and generational change in London English. There's an outward-facing project as well with the website and the project on multilingual English. She has also worked on what is called accent bias. That is how the way you speak then informs the social reality in which you engage. And that, of course, has huge, as you can imagine, huge implications also for the wider world. So Devyani's work not only is theoretically grounded, but also has real world impact, which is something which is important, but also something which we as academics increasingly think is important for us to do. She also has a background in typology in South Asian languages, also in South Asian English. So there the study of diaspora Englishes comes into the picture as well. So it's very, very rounded. And she also engages a lot, in addition to the accent bias, with the media. So she's frequently on the BBC, word of mouth, I think you participated in. And so also then informs public discourse on English, which is important because, of course, people feel very strongly about English and the way we speak English, the values attached with this. So to have academic input in these discussions, I think it's both important for us as academics, but also for the wider societal discourse. The work today, I think, is new. We're looking forward to it. Devyani, thank you very much for talking to us, and please join me in the front for the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lutz, and thank you to the Society for inviting me. It's such a great opportunity to share what we've been doing and to get your feedback on it as well. And thank you to Richard for incredible AV skills, getting this going. If anyone online has issues, I suppose, maybe just how should they let us know? Just, or maybe... Yeah, or you could, I might see a message pop up, but I hope you can see the slides and hear me. So I'll also try, I might skip a couple of slides because we're starting a little bit late and I don't want to keep you too long. So I've got a lot on my slides and I'm covering a lot of different points, but some of that is just because in our discussion, you might be more interested in one or another part of the talk. So apologies if I skip over a little bit just to keep the main points in sight. So just to start broad and think about what we'll be doing today, in the late 60s, there was a documentary produced for IBM called Powers of 10. It was turned into a kind of coffee table book. You might have encountered it at some time. I encountered it 30 years later as an undergraduate. And it's a simple kind of concept that zooms out and zooms in just to look at structure in the universe at different levels. So it goes up to 100 million light years, and then it zooms down to subatomic particles. And it's actually a very visual kind of project. It taps into, I think, what most people find fascinating, which is you can see an object that looks inert, and when you zoom in, it's teeming with life and movement. And it might be a bit of a presumptuous analogy, but that's in a way what I'd like to do today. We're going to start by very briefly looking at change at the level of a speech community, looking at London in real time. And we look at take a classic variationist Lebovian perspective. And then we're not actually going to look at this, just to mention that when we look at a large community changing over time, we do think about the individual. We think in terms of social network position, audience alignment, we think of communities of practice. But what I'm interested in looking at today is not so much the social identity side of things, but what I'm calling individual cognition or individual difference. So the individual system and how we can relate that back up to very large scale change that we see. So we have a little individual in the middle of, in that graphic, in the middle of ongoing waves of change. What is the place of that person's cognitive system in ongoing change? And there has been work and interest in this recently in historical cases of post-colonial and contact varieties. So Ingham 2017 looked at Norman French, San Sanchez looking at Latin American Spanish development, and I've written about post-colonial Englishes and how in those cases acquisitional effects in the individual might be the basis of long-term community outcomes. So we're going to look today at London, and as I said, we'll start in part one with some very new data on large-scale change, and I'll explain that. I'll give you quick examples from phonology and from syntax, and then we'll switch to a very small scale and look at some of the limits of that kind of an aggregated picture. So we look at what I'm calling individual cognition, if you like, the variable individual system. And we'll look at individual repertoires as opposed to our usual reliance on interview sampling, individual awareness. Often we can't look at that when we do large-scale analysis, and individual degrees of control over variables, where we often assume control and just look at diffusion of change in native speaker communities. So let's begin with the large scale. I'm sorry, I may go a little quickly because I'd like to have time to look at those three small scale themes. So in our current project, and I'll give you the details of that in a minute, we're looking at recent changes in London English, more in East London. And as you probably know, some of the most foundational work on 20th century change in London English was done by Paul Kurzweil and Jenny Cheshire and their team, defining multicultural London English, a new working class variety in East London. If you spend time in London, or even if you watch TV, you'll hear this new variety. You'll hear examples of it a bit later in the talk. And what they showed, which I'm not going to go into in this talk, is a huge change, at least in working class East London, inner East London speech, a huge change in the phonology, the grammar, discourse structure, all aspects of East London English, from Cockney to what's called multicultural London English. We're now doing a project almost 20 years since their data. And so we have an opportunity that's quite rare to look at the second generation in a way of a new dialect and look at what the rate of change is. And I'll go into a bit of detail in a minute. But the first part of this talk is going to be a comparison of their earlier data with what we find 20 years later. So this is our team. And just mentioning Paul Kurzweil, because we are reanalyzing their data to be able to compare it to our new data. And I've highlighted Andy Gibson, without whom most of the analyses that I'm presenting today wouldn't have been possible. But the team is also working on many other strands of analysis. So a very brief overview. I'm not going to talk about my earlier work in London, just to note that it was on a mono-ethnolectal variety that I'll mention in passing. Then, of course, we have the original multicultural London English projects that we will use as a comparative base. And now our project, Generations of London English, zooms out. It doesn't look only at MLE, it looks across features and groups more generally to look at change in progress and other questions. And today I'm just going to look at teenagers for the first part and do a real-time comparison over 20 years of what they were doing when Paul and Jenny and Sue and Avind were doing their work and how it looks today. I won't go over all of these details. I can come back to it. We have a lot of different kinds of data gathered on the project, but I'm going to focus on a sample of East London teenagers that was designed to match Paul and Jenny's original projects. And I'll mention South London very briefly. So when we think about the real-time picture, we could predict a number of different things. If you're familiar with Paul and Jenny's publications, you'll know that there was no question that a new dialect formed. There also seemed to be some founder effects. So one prediction is that we have early homogeneity. A dialect formed about 40 years ago in East London through what they described as group second language acquisition, and later it's specialized into social subgroupings. That could be one thing that happens. And another possibility is that the dialect that they described originated as a cluster of speech practices that were already differentiated socially, and these founder effects might persist. So we would have early heterogeneity and then stability. And of course, it's impossible to tell from the original data set, but now we can test these. And if I have too much on the next slides, the main thing to take away is that it looks like the second of these, quite strikingly so. So I'll show you a few variables, a few phonological features, and then a couple of syntactic features very briefly. So sorry for doing this in such little detail, but it's just to give you a sense of things. So we start with the goat vowel. So here in MLE, there's a backing variant of goat. So I'm very bad at producing all British goat vowels. I have a very Indian goat vowel, but goat, so a standard slightly fronting goat, contrasts very audibly with goat, a backing one. So it's not a continuum, it's two different variants. And when we look at the MLE variant, so here what you see is on the left, the original MLE data analyzed in the same way as our new data on the right. You can, these are not raw means, these are model predicted means, so taking into account other factors. And the bars that you see are by ethnicity of the teenagers. Above is boys, below is girls. And you see, first of all, how striking the stability is over time. You see almost no change over time. So we see boys showing more focused multi-ethnic sharing of this feature. It's just the white boys, white British boys. White European or white other are not in these slides for reasons I can explain, but white British heritage boys, Anglo in the old projects, are lower. But you can see, if you can see the tiny dots, there are some outliers of white British boys who have very high use of this distinctive MLE phonological features. But when we look at girls, we see very different usage. So the first thing you can see is from the beginning, it's been a boy feature. I'll come back to that. So, but what you do see is South Asian girls having very high use. So the wrong interpretation would be South Asian girls are the most like MLE boys. It's not at all true. It's actually that they have a direct heritage language source. In fact, their social networks are the least tied to the boys. And then we also see that white British girls are the most traditional of all the groups, which is true for almost all of our features. And then we have some global patterns. As I said, white British less participating, but as I said, some very high users among boys. Caribbean heritage speakers being closer to white Anglo heritage speakers, which is an interesting detail where we find, we have a concept in our project that we call English depth, which is how long English has been in the community as a native variety of some sort. And Caribbean speakers have the longest English depth compared to Indian, South Asian, African, and we see effects of that. So very briefly, I'll probably skip over the details for these. Again, if we look at the face vowel, which has a continuum of fronting and shortening of the trajectory, we see the boys, if you can see, except for the blue line of the white British boys, the lines onsets, the horizontal line is their onset. They're closer, more similar to each other in the raised fronted variant. Girls are more spread out, especially 20 years ago. You can see they had these monoethnolectal styles and they've come together a little bit. But we see the same tendencies of ordering across communities. And then DH stopping, again, I'm just skipping over these just to show you how regular the stability is across variables. So here again, the dark green is saying dem and dare, so alveolar DH stopping. And you can see initially it's associated with Black identity, not either Caribbean or African, but both. But by the new data, the South Asian boys are using it too. But if you look below, you see the dental variant. That's the one you can hear me using, them, there. That's used very much in the lead is, again, South Asian girls who have their own monoethnolectal thing going on, and still to a lesser degree. So it's the same kind of more monoethnolectal differences for girls, more focused usage by boys. So I won't go through the summary, but for all of these and other features, we see some indications of change, but very strong evidence that even in the earliest MLE data that we have from the earlier projects, these fine distinctions by gender and ethnicity were in place very early and have been stable. Another type of data on our project, and I'm going to come back to these when we go micro. So I'll just show you one takeaway from them now, and then I'll come back to this slide. We also did a syntax judgment questionnaire. So in the original projects, there were a number of syntactic features described for this dialect, but they were based on the usage in the interviews, which we also plan to do. But we wanted to see the wider distribution of acceptance of these constructions across all our participants. So we see why are you shouting at me for? The man pronoun on the top right, which we'll come back to. Let's go Sainsbury's, so dropping the preposition and sometimes dropping a determiner. And then finally, allow. These are all innovations, recent innovations documented in the original MLE projects. The one thing to note for now, to support what we saw for phonology, is if you look at the 40 plus, 50 plus category, can you see how much lower the acceptance is? So that's in Paul Kurzweil's analysis, the start of MLE is around 40 years ago. And so those respondents are falling outside and of the birth of MLE, and they're not accepting it as much. The main thing to note is once acceptance begins, it tends to be quite stable. It's remained in place. So even with syntax, we see this sudden formation and then continued acceptance. I'll talk about the sub-types a little bit later. So what we see, hopefully you will agree from what I've shown you, is we don't see continuous change that in the original MLE projects, something was formed and it's continued to churn along and change. We see some kind of a tipping point 40 years ago that Kurzweil and Cheshire have written about, some fairly abrupt innovation, a formation point, and then the same structured social heterogeneity continuing to a large extent. And there is a model in the history of English, originally coming from typology more generally, taking the idea of punctuated equilibrium from biology and suggesting that language change can have that rhythm. And to me, what we found 20 years after the original projects looks a lot like uneven rate of change. So it looks like what Paul and Jenny documented was a punctuation. And actually, we have a very high degree of stabilization since then. So we have the Norman conquest, and then we have MLE, and then we'll wait and see what happens. What dramatic thing will happen in about, 100 years. A little social context for why that punctuation might have happened. Rather than seeing a dialect emerging in a kind of vacuum suddenly, what we see historically from a range of earlier research is monoethnolectal varieties emerging from early migration, post-war migration, Asian, Caribbean influenced. And then we have in the early 90s increased, much more diverse migration, Eastern Europe, Middle East, wider South Asian and African migration. And then we have this tipping point that was described in a lot of detail by the MLE projects. But what we see is, even in the formation at that point, there were subtypes that we just saw, boys doing a certain thing, boys leading and being multi-ethnolectal, girls' social networks leading to more mono-ethnolectal types. And those are what we see continuing now. So I think there's a lot of talk in sociolinguistics about a wild level of fluidity in cities like London, that the old systems have fallen apart and everything is very individual and agentive. But I think this is one of the most structured things I've seen. So I think when we step back, even if in close up, London looks chaotic speech-wise, it's actually complex but quite systematic. So we've, just checking what you're seeing. It's not that we don't look at the individual when we see these kinds of systematic outcomes over time. We know that social class, gender, social network, social practice, and identity feed into these. So Penny Eckert's work, Leslie Milroy, Labov, they've talked about the individual in such change. But what I'd like to look at a little bit more, and these are not brand new, in fact, all three the elements I'll talk about were in Labov's original work, but they are present to a varying degree when we do large-scale analysis. How mechanistic is the way that these changes flow through individuals? And do individual differences in systems play a part in either speeding up or slowing down change of that kind? So let's start by thinking of risks of the kind of aggregated analysis that I just did. One of them is relying on sociolinguistic interviews. So we get one sample of hopefully good quality speech from everyone in our data set. It's very difficult to get anything different, although Labov had a design to get some range. Another thing that we are forced to do is look at forms in quite separated from their place in an individual's linguistic system. So we start looking just at forms moving around the population. And then we have a tendency to forget that native speakers might not be native in every form that they are using, even though they are native speakers. So we're going to look at people's individual repertoires of speaking beyond the interview, awareness or not of forms, and degree of control over forms, regardless of, not regardless of whether these are all native speakers of English, but how much they control innovative forms, for instance, or conservative forms. So we're getting increasingly microscopic. I don't know if we've been at the level of the Milky Way or the planet, but we'll go, in fact, with these three, we'll go, control in a way is the subatomic. It's very difficult to link these directly, causally, to the big patterns that I showed you, but I'll try and suggest ways that they are quite fundamental. So we'll start with repertoire. In earlier work, I looked at repertoire in the Punjabi London community over generations, and I won't explain this particular slide. It's just here in case you want to come back to another example of how much repertoire tells us actually about a community. The main point I would highlight is that the initial analysis looking at interview data was not the right picture for this community of how the language is changing according to gender. Actually, the way their repertoires were, how much they switch Asian style on and off, told us a lot more about a reversal, actually, where the young women were more like the older men. I'm not giving the whole story of why that happened, but it's just so that you see that repertoire data, gray is more Asian style, white is more British style, can be very used in a regular way for understanding community change. So let's look at repertoire in the new data set that I'm talking about, the Generations of London English project. One design that we had with the teenagers was that the interviewer would leave the room and tell them to relax and say, you can do what you like, I'm out, the school doesn't care what you're doing. So they knew that they could just do what they like. They had some prompts that they could pull out of a box and talk about, kind of controversial or funny things. So in this plot on the right, the dotted line is when Andy, the interviewer, left the room. And this is just an example of reactions to leaving the room. So I'll show you two different individuals, a white British heritage teenager called White Anglo in the previous older work, never sure which term to use, and then a Caribbean heritage young man as well. And what you'll see is that Jim 67, as we call him, doesn't change his phonology. And across the recordings we have for him, his phonology is pretty fixed. But he does turn other things up to mark a shift in style. Whereas the Caribbean heritage speaker changes much more holistically. So you see it for the face vowel in that plot. And it's not that he turns it up to MLE levels completely, but he activates the MLE range. But if you listen to these clips, you should be able to hear just holistically how Jim 67, white British, I give the ethnicity because you can't always tell when you hear MLE speakers, doesn't really shift, even though he's shifted his key, his tone of interaction. I hope you can hear this online as well.
I mostly played football when I was growing up. That's how I really made friends.
And then when he's chatting after Andy has left the room.
Stained my fucking Air Force Ones.
So you can hear that he's talking about other things, he's swearing, but hopefully you could hear his phonology didn't change very much. And then Jim 68, also a teenager, talking to the interviewer.
My school in the Caribbean came here. My mom is a beautician, a makeup artist, and a hairstylist.
And then talking without the interviewer.
So I wanted to get renegade. I used to go there earlier.
So you can hear he says he's DH stopping, his vowels have shifted. So he has a wider range in turning on and off. And we've looked across, this is just a pair to listen to. In my view, it's not actually accidental that the person with the wider range is one of our Black Caribbean speakers, especially boys. So here, when should I aim to stop? Because I have lots of interesting clips, but I don't want to get too far. A quarter past? Okay, I'll try and keep it a bit less than that, but thanks. Okay, so I want to just play you another individual, another Black speaker, but now this is going beyond the teenagers. But this is just, I feel that with our project, one of the important things that's become more apparent to me analyzing the data that I did not have in focus when we started was the huge repertoire range in the Black community. And there's a terrible amount of stereotyping with multicultural London English in the media. So I'd like you to, first of all, hear a Cockney accented older speaker. So in all our projects, Black and Asian speakers over the age of 50 acquired the vernacular of that time, which was traditional London English towards the Cockney end. All right, so an older man.
Well, back in the day, Bakery trips was like school holidays and things like that. Obviously, your parents would go to work. Yeah. What they would do is we have the keys on left underneath the mat so you can get in and out. Yeah.
So you should be, if you're familiar with Cockney, traditional London vernacular, he has lots of phonological features of it. So he said in and out, his mouth vowel is traditional. It's just his age. So there's been a lot written about London Jamaican, an earlier variety by sociolinguists, but we have to remember that all of these individuals learn the baseline vernacular of London as well. So we don't want a stereotype that, non-white Londoners always had some monoethnolectal way of speaking. Actually, most speakers had this and a Jamaican style. And then I'll skip the middle, which is different types of South and East Black British English and multicultural. But listen to this young man who's around 30, speaking to, sorry about this, speaking to the interviewer.
Because if I do it, by the time I run away from the house, they've seen me.
It's completely standard style. He's talking about a game called Knockdown Ginger. Knockdown Ginger. You have to knock on a door and run away. And then talking with a friend.
4 months step tomorrow. Any tables gone. Jeez. Man like you, man. You might have heard in it.
His phonology actually doesn't change that much, but he's completely shifted to all kinds of MLE forms with his friend. I focused in on Black speakers and went beyond teenagers because I think that Londoners of Caribbean and African heritage have a particular story in our real-time picture regarding repertoire. As I mentioned, the older speakers, although we've talked a lot about London Jamaican, were also Cockney speakers. It's the same for my British Asian older speakers in my earlier project. They were bi-dialectal often. So they had this broad range that reflected a very broad and geographically mobile experience. Then we have different varieties in between. And what we find in our data now is that the 30-something, especially a group we have of African heritage 30-something Black speakers in North London in our data have not Cockney and London Jamaican, but MLE and Standard. And it's not geographical mobility, it's social mobility. So that chart that you see there is from a Sutton Trust report on participation in university. And you can see the biggest change has been in the Black community. So there's a significant type of social mobility happening, and their repertoires are showing that. In fact, their repertoires in a way are doing that mobility. By looking at their, to the extent we could, to their repertoire, the fact that it might be broader, we start to see the social engagement that's a part of their linguistic system. And then it brings us back to something that is familiar from variationist sociolinguistics, which is that Labov said interior groups, that is not the extremes of working class and upper classes, but the upper working class and lower middle class are the change makers. They're the ones who move vernacular forms upward. And when we look at repertoires, we see the mechanism. So you heard these speakers, you heard the Jim 68, who has developed this ability in his system to really turn on and off his MLE features. And you heard the 30-something completely able to switch between standard style and not. So many of those 30-somethings are in banking. They've experienced very significant social mobility compared to their parents. So by looking at the individual and the repertoire, I'm not trying to talk about identity in this talk, but the linguistic system. The fact that the system encompasses that range of control is a big part of the change that we see. And a lot of people ask people who work on MLE, is MLE the new standard? Because we know that change comes from vernaculars. But it's not that the most dramatic vernacular variety becomes the new standard. It's the mildest elements that tip over into standard use. And that's what we heard with these Black speakers going into banking and law and taking little elements of MLE, switching off most of it, but that's possibly the mechanism. So that's how looking at repertoire can actually fill in quite a bit of our story of how community change might be happening. I want to show you a bit on awareness of the linguistic system. Again, we'll try and, although there's always a social element to what I'm talking about, I'm more interested in the linguistic system of individuals. So I'll start with one quick example and then give you details, both to do with awareness. So going from Black speakers to white speakers in our data, some of the most MLE systems are not necessarily Black speakers, as we've discussed, but white European speakers. So you can listen to this from our newer data, the lower one, just for an example. So if you hear that guy, you might not guess that he's white Eastern European heritage. That's typical with MLE described by the original projects. But the reason that a lot of working class Eastern European teenage boys use, and girls, so Cheshire et al. Had a great example of Abigail, a young girl. They acquire the local vernacular in some ways more than other heritage kids. Remember that I was talking about Eastern European speakers being some of the highest adopters of multicultural London English, especially working class, but not only. And what we would say is happening, and that's been mentioned in earlier work as well, is that for them, I mentioned English depth, for an Eastern European a new arrival, let's say a kid arrives age 5 into East London, in their family, in their own community, there's very little English. It's a Polish family, as compared to South Asian, African, Caribbean, all of whom have varieties of English in the mix. And so the majority system that they're exposed to is MLE, and they don't usually have that many reference points for anything else in the beginning. So they acquire it as their British variety. Just to give you one example, when I did work in the Asian community, I was confused at first with first generation migrants who had come as adults to West London. They were using a lot of glottal stop in the beginning of the interview, when you're usually most self-conscious, most formal. So they would say, I got my passport, and then it would go into like talk and these, retractities. And I was wondering, how come they're using the vernacular form in the most formal speech? And then I realized it's British to them. It means Britishness for them because their frame of reference coming into the system is different. So Paul Kurzweil has a beautiful example from Norway. There are examples from the early MLE work of Abigail who did, for her, it's the local variety. It's the speakers who have lots of other reference varieties that might notice this seems to be more of a stigmatized variety. They may or may not. And Lebov made a beautiful observation that this is true for all kids. So we think we're speaking unmarked system, but kids hear it as old. And that's the engine of change. So for them as well, their frame of reference is different. And that's why one of the reasons they increment away from older forms. So again, this is a totally individual feature, which is what's my frame of reference? What do these forms mean to me? In our project, we have middle-class Eastern European kids, young teenagers, whose parents are bankers, who would normally not be MLE speakers, using full MLE because for them it's the local English variety. They don't have the stigmatized association. So that's one type of awareness that's quite interesting with a direct effect of accelerating change. But I thought you might enjoy seeing another interesting dimension of awareness with syntax. So I told you I would come back to that judgment survey we did. It's very difficult to do judgment surveys on vernacular syntax, as many of David Willis would know and others might know. But you can try it, and actually we got somewhat noisy but somewhat informative results. But there were many, it's gone again, come back. Whatever I just did works. So there were many syntactic features described by Jenny Cheshire, by her colleagues in earlier work, a new pronoun, a new quotative, different systems of verb agreement, why for, why they're looking at me like that for, causal interrogative with a specific kind of a confrontational and purpose function, and then dropping the preposition and the determiner, so I went chicken shop or didn't come school. So I just want to very briefly show you, I won't play the recordings of them saying these. We were fortunate, and it was unplanned, that because we were recording so many activities with these teenagers, we recorded them while they were doing the questionnaire on their phone. So we got their commentary while they were doing it, which is quite funny. There's some funny ones I couldn't include, but we have all this commentary, but it's not very systematically collected because we didn't plan on it. But it was actually quite informative to look at. So now I'll explain the contrast in each of these. So why are you shouting at me for is the MLE form. We put in why'd you grow up in France for, because it violates the constraints that David Hall and Jenny Cheshire described for this construction. It doesn't have a confrontational, immediate purpose kind of meaning, right? So we expect why'd you grow up in France for to have lower ratings, and it does. They tried to warn me, but man didn't care, man pronoun. He let man know, we don't expect a difference. This is just different uses of the man pronoun, and we see that. Let's Go Sainsbury's. David Hall has written about and described by Jenny and Sue on the original project. Let's Go Sainsbury's, my kids say it. We live in East London, and I once asked them, do you sometimes say, let's go to Sainsbury's? And they said, well, if you're very sophisticated, you might say, let's go to Sainsbury's. So I thought, okay, prepositions have become posh. But one of the analyses of this construction is that it has a pseudo-incorporation structure. So you shouldn't be able to insert a lot of material like with me, like a prepositional phrase. So come with me, Sainsbury's should be worse. I'm going straight chicken shop after the show should be worse. And we actually see lower ratings for these. And I won't talk about allow. So when they were doing them, these judgments, there was a lot of noise actually. There is clear evidence of some responses where they're typing no, but we can tell from what they're saying that they use it. But let's look first at one that showed slightly limited awareness. I won't play it in the interest of time, but the first participant says, why are you shouting at me for? Shouting at me for, is that slang? I thought that was normal. So he cannot identify what the issue is. Then he says, oh, it's the for, isn't it? I might say it because I'm not going to engage. He's still not saying because sometimes I'm vernacular. He's just thinking about the function of it. And then why'd you grow up in France? For he says, I feel like I don't say the for part. So he can report accurately on the grammatical constraints, but he had trouble even noticing it. And then later he uses it, and the interviewer and he laugh about how he was explaining what a word means and he used it naturally. And another participant as well, yeah, what's wrong with that? So it's a bit lower awareness, this feature, and it's a feature that is spreading. It has quite a healthy life compared to a couple of other features. Another one is PD drop. Let's Go Sainsbury's. It is spreading. It's not brand new to MLE, by the way. It's been around at a low level in British dialects. But this is the kind of response you want when you have a form that is supposed to be ungrammatical. This participant says, come with me, Sainsbury's. What the hell? Because this is the one with me that he shouldn't like, and he doesn't like it. He said, oh, I have to say if I would say it, if my friends would say it. Who the hell would say that? I hope none of my friends say that. But then later he gets to Let's Go Sainsbury's, and he's like, yeah, that's fine. He just goes through it like that. So again, he knows the constraints as an MLE speaker. But it's a bit, sorry, the next example also shows a clear, they're very good at articulating, like many of you have done field elicitation, very good at articulating the grammatical constraints. So the second one says, I would just say come Sainsbury's. If I say come with me, then I'll say to. He says it so nicely. That's what's predicted for the grammar. But then at the end is very interesting what he says. So he says, otherwise come Sainsbury's, come this place, come that place. Let's go there, let's go there. And then he says, is let's go there English as well, like proper English? And it's a very good question because let's go there has the same structure. And so you see, like when we go into how people are talking about it, for me, it made me realize, oh, that's why it might spread, because it's actually an arbitrary boundary. And now that Come Sainsbury's has picked up, it's completely continuous with standard. I like the way he calls English. English means what teachers speak. But hopefully you can see how that reveals a little bit to us how problematic it can be, and how a vernacular form that's so smoothly continuous with standard forms might spread. In fact, here are two examples of its spread. Our kids, in our project, we have 4, 5, 6-year-olds that we're tracking longitudinally. Let's go box 3 now in the diapics. They go from box 1 to box 2, so they use it very naturally. But even a child in West London, upper middle class in an independent school saying, I'm going Paris, Madrid. So the form is very broad. I hear teachers using it. I find myself mirroring it with my kids. But it could be A, the contiguity with standard constructions, and B, this low awareness that it's maybe syntactic forms are a little bit lower awareness. By contrast, when we asked survey questions about the pronouns, for instance, man, mandem, it was a different level of commentary. So yeah, but nowadays a bit less, it's slowly dying out. Maybe it's a younger thing. They're very easily picking up on all the things we know about change, age grading, change in progress, overlap of old and new forms, even historical origin. They're like, man's, by the way, if you think it's Jamaican, it's not, it's UK. So very different way of talking about what this person calls slang. As linguists, we often dismiss when vernacular speakers use the term slang, and they do use it a bit for technically what we call slang and for non-standard language. But actually, they are making an important distinction here. So no speaker who did this survey said, yeah, what's wrong with that when they saw a man pronoun example. It wasn't below their level of consciousness. They know that it's a group marker to use that pronoun. So it's in a different category, and we should take it seriously when they say this is slang, because it has a completely different life. These forms change more quickly. We know that they have a different, they stay more defined within certain communities. So again, by looking at individual commentary and awareness, we realize that there's a structure to these non-standard forms that we're talking about, where some would be predicted not to cross over into standard usage at all, and others are. So these two examples are nice because they corrected my questionnaire. They were like, well, if you're going to say was, weren't, you can't have such a long sentence. So that was very interesting to me because we don't usually look at it. But he said, if you're going to use, here he's saying slang for dialect grammar, because I had written, she weren't very nice about it. It's just, she weren't nice. If you're going to use slang, don't make it so long. It's quite an interesting observation. And the man pronoun, we had come up with, I've got 10 men chasing me down the road to test whether plural man is compatible with plural. And he said, I could, but I got an effing posse after me. He's making fun of how many mans. And he's like, you wouldn't say I got 10 men. Yeah, you can't count the mandem, just enough man chasing me. So it's true. It's a bad MLE sentence that we came up with. So there's quite interesting awareness of the system. The last awareness bit, and then I'm going to just very briefly show you control and wrap up. But it's nice to hear the highest level of awareness is stylization, when you perform that system separately from your default way of speaking. So this first one, A reads out one of the prompts, we are not in the room, and you'll hear B, the boy, he marks the stylization with psh, and like he's kind of, not, I didn't do a proper kiss, like that, but you'll see his pronouns shift. Let's play it.
What you're afraid of.
What am I afraid of?
Yeah, and it's something you're afraid of. I don't know.
That's a thing I know. I'm not so afraid of anything.
I'm not that scared much either.
I'm a religious man. I'm afraid of God.
It's an interesting speaker because to me, he's white British. He's white British, but he has quite a lot of Asian MLE style. But you can hear how his pronoun shifts. So the stylized tough guy uses man, but he himself then says, I'm a religious man. So the other one is nice too. It's a very positive stylization of African variety of English. But what you heard with the first one was what's been described by Asif Agha as a characterological figure. When you hear that kind of stylization, it evokes a particular character, right? When he said, man's not afraid of anything, you picture this tough guy. And the same for the one I didn't play, you picture a very particular person. When individuals do that kind of stylizing, they imbue that way of speaking with very specific social characteristics. And in the community change, that can constrain over time. It can constrain the uses of that style. I actually think very strong MLE has become a style. There's a term roadman that's associated with it, and it can constrain over time the users of that style. So it's another individual behavior, this time, of course, quite social, but in terms of awareness, it's a higher level of engagement with the grammar and characterizing it, which can affect long-term outcomes. So I'm going to very briefly show you the third type of individual behavior. I do want to mention it because it's an interesting, to me, very interesting additional dimension of sociolinguistic and style variation that moves away from or enhances our focus on identity that's quite common for sociolinguistics. So when we talk about control of our speech, it's very common in psycholinguistics, in bilingualism, to think about it. But in sociolinguistics, we don't usually pay that much attention to whether a feature is default for me as a speaker or effortful. But it is absolutely true that for many or most native speakers, there's a way of speaking that's more comfortable for them and a way that's less. And that's, of course, Lebov's original definition of the vernacular is the way of speaking that's most automatic and unthinking for you. But over time, we've taken an interest in social meaning, which absolutely is, you know, the bread and butter of how we style shift, what we do with our language. But I think, especially in the kind of data we have in this project, it's meaningful to understand how control patterns look in the data, and again, whether that relates at all to types of group change. So I'll skip this. It's some case study individuals, all of whom are MLE speakers, who we started looking at more closely for control of MLE. So what I mean as a critique is when we do a community study, if someone is a high user of an innovative form, we just treat it as one of their forms. We don't question whether that's a default or there. In fact, Lebov's definition has a confound, which is your most relaxed style is called your vernacular. So the non-standard form is always treated as a person's most relaxed form. But it, especially in London, where there are many vernaculars, it might not be. So I'll just show you briefly and then wrap up. I'll show you a test we did of MLE speakers when they were doing their word list at the end of their recordings and interviews. We put in a slow reading and a fast reading manipulation for sentences. And so I'll first play you Jim 67, who you heard before. He was the one who didn't really shift his phonology when the interviewer left. So this is the price vowel, and you can see plots of his slow. They were slightly faster, but they're trying to speak faster. The idea is when you speak faster, you have less time to control the output. And so you should default to the one that's more comfortable for you. So here he is with slow. Oh, I hope we don't freeze.
I like that did eaten cream. She fell off her back and broke her arm.
Those are his price vowels, slow and fast.
The deal of eating the ice cream. She fell off her back and broke her arm.
They're very similar. And then the GIF 40, also white British, a girl. Remember, girls have more traditional vernacular than anyone now among teenagers. Slow.
I like the idea of eating the ice cream. She fell off her back and broke her arm.
So pras is the MLE setting. She's producing it in her read speech, which by Lebovian methods would mean, yeah, that must be her vernacular. She's even using it in read speech. But when she speeds up, you should be able to hear it slightly more Cockney.
I like the idea of eating ice cream. She fell off her back and broke her arm.
Boik. It came out fast. So even though she uses MLE, and I'm going to skip some of the other evidence. There are some other really nice clips of how, I won't play it, but there's one of the same girl saying, I'm trying to think of what to say when she was asked something with her friends, and she uses MLE say, like and then at another point she says, I don't know what else to say to herself, and she's more Cockney. So even like with different monitoring, she shifts. And she has more traditional vernacular syntax than the boys. So I'll skip these. There's quite a few other types of evidence we have that there are some speakers, like Jim 68, the Caribbean young man who became more MLE when the interviewer left. And so those are the classic Lebovian marker type speakers who are suppressing their vernacular forms, and then when they relax, they use it. They're completely kind of non-variers. Jim 67 is on the boundary. But then we have a few people who are performing MLE, but when we really push the system, we see that it's not actually their most comfortable. They have multiple vernaculars, and it's a bit of a performance. So we have this real-time data that supports that as well. So with this final feature of control, we have some high users who are not native-like but want to be using it. And in terms of group change, we could find that those kinds of speakers lag behind, but they could also be the ones that change the phonology. If they're high users, but it's not really their underlying form, they might, and that comes back to the early analysis of group second language acquisition by Cheshire and Kurzweil and others, that it might be these marginal nativeness states that are where the change in the phonetic system is happening. Oh, it's frozen again, even without. Oh yeah, it's okay. So we saw first quite a strikingly orderly system that MLE was born with gender ethnicity differences in a way, maybe, and seems to have stayed that way. It's hit this kind of equilibrium state, not changing as fast. But then we saw, looking at the individual system, that some systems are broad or narrow, and that can affect rates of diffusion or direction of diffusion. We found different degrees of awareness, which can lead to circumscribed use or very fast diffusion because of lack of awareness. And then even with control, we saw speakers who seem very vernacular, but when we look closely, their system is actually different to another vernacular system and might be the locus of change. So I've said a few times, I've tried to move away from identity-focused analysis of this variation, but rather look at also a cognitively realistic model of what these individuals are doing. And in a way, it's bringing back what we call first wave elements into sociolinguistics. Catherine Campbell-Kibler has usefully said that, in fact, social cognition is the system that we're using. So we really should have an integrated model of when, why, and how these big social system changes are meeting the linguistic system. Thank you very much.